Yes, I know. But we're doing it again. What's up everyone, I'm the one and only Zage, and although I've covered Mihawk vs Shanks on the channel already, chapter 1058 has created a lot of new conversation that isn't really new on this subject, and Oda has arguably ended this debate once and for all. Before we delve into it though, if you're new to the channel or you like content like this, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel now more than ever to help me out with the algorithm, and as always, your support is much appreciated. So with the abolishment of the warlord system, the Marines had to go back to the drawing board and reevaluate the bounties of these pirates, as up until that point it was frozen as they were allies with the government. To deal with the threat of the Marines, Mihawk alongside Crocodile founded a pirate alliance called Cross Guild and invited Buggy along, who became the figurehead of this organization and the new emperor. All that is to say is that Cross Guild has become a massive threat to the world government, and a big reason for that is Mihawk himself. Aokiji explains that bounties are valued based on the strength of the criminal and how much of a threat they pose to the world government. Mihawk is not like other Yonko captains who have massive pirate crews, territories and influence across the world. Mihawk in his past was known as the Marine Hunter. However, when brand new was announcing his bounty, the one thing that was emphasized was his individual strength. Mihawk was awarded a 3.59 billion berry bounty, which brand new says is a fitting total for the world's strongest swordsman. Brand new also emphasized that Mihawk has even greater sword skills or swordsmanship than Shanks. Now, for those who think that Shanks is stronger than Mihawk, this has been one of their arguments for a long time, that Mihawk has greater swordsmanship or has better skill with a sword than Shanks does, but Shanks has more power and is overall stronger than Mihawk. However, where is this basis in the story that there's a separation between skill and strength or power? Since when does having better swordsmanship not mean you're not the stronger swordsman? But before we tackle this, let's tackle this idea of Shanks not being a swordsman. When Shanks met Whitebeard, the thing that Whitebeard highlighted about him, other than the fact that he was once on Roger's crew, was the fact that he had legendary duels with Mihawk. Now stop and think about this for a second. Why would Oda narratively have Mihawk's rival who had legendary duels against him not be a swordsman? It's just kind of a weird thing that fans have created to kind of duck under and around Mihawk's title. Another thing to consider is, narratively, why would brand new compare Mihawk's swordsmanship to be greater than Shanks's if the strength that Shanks is known for isn't his swordsmanship? It'd be like if Oda decided to emphasize the strength of Mihawk's swordsmanship by comparing him to Kaido. It makes no sense because Kaido isn't a swordsman. He doesn't fight with any swordsmanship, but Shanks does. That's why Shanks is appropriate in comparing and emphasizing the strength of Mihawk. There's also this idea held by some that Shanks potentially has other ways of fighting or abilities outside of his sword which would make him not a swordsman, and the proof for this line of reasoning would be this SBS statement where Oda questions how does Shanks actually fight. Now the issue with this is that Oda questioning how Shanks actually fights doesn't necessarily mean he doesn't fight like swordsmen like Mihawk, Zoro or Vista. And even if he does have other weapons and abilities, that doesn't necessarily mean that he isn't a swordsman. For example, Zoro says that Kaku's entire body is a weapon. However, Kaku says himself that he is the best swordsman or has the greatest swordsmanship in CP9. However, as we can see in the fight with Zoro, that Kaku actually does other abilities, like for example the Shigan. The guy literally uses his nose, his giraffe nose, as a pistol gun. He uses his long neck as a whip. This is outside of his sword. However, no one says that he's something other than a swordsman. Everyone categorizes him as a swordsman. Another person would be Law, who Oda has categorized and called a swordsman, but he has other abilities like the Gamma Knife. The Gamma Knife doesn't look like typical swordsmanship in One Piece to me. However, no one in the story or Oda has said that Law is a swordsman and something else. There isn't this swordsman plus something type of fighter. So there's no basis of this in the story. However, for Shanks, people run with it or go as far as to say that Shanks isn't a swordsman entirely, despite the fact that his rival and the thing that, you know, he's actually most known for, his greatest feat as of this recording that is known, is dueling with Mihawk, the greatest swordsman. It's just kind of a weird thing that people have come up in their minds. Now, there are a couple other examples we could have gone through to highlight this point, like for example, Big Mom, who in her Vivid card is stated to have learned the fierce swordsmanship of the giants, yet she has other abilities that she can do with her devil fruit, like for example, creating homies like Prometheus, Hera, or Zeus that have lightning and fire powers. However, when she's using her strongest attacks, she's using Hera or Prometheus in conjunction with Napoleon or all three combined to obviously use sword attacks that are clearly inspired by the swordsmanship of the giants. I'm sure you guys get the point. It also doesn't help with the Shanks argument that in the Vivid card data book, it states about Shanks' sword Griffin that it is his beloved sword that's had a long history of battles. So why would Shanks, who allegedly has these other weapons, abilities and styles of fighting that supersede his swordsmanship and would make his overall power greater than Mihawk's, why does he have such a long history of battles with his sword? Why does he love it so much? Why is it that in every major clash and moment in which Shanks is about to fight seriously, he uses his sword? And for those that may bring up Shanks briefly stunning and paralyzing Greenbull with his Conqueror's Haki, which mind you is a great feat and portrayal for Shanks, if that doesn't make him a swordsman, or proves and shows that Shanks has power that supersedes his swordsmanship, then Zoro stunning and paralyzing Monet when he was running up to her doesn't make him a swordsman as well. This logic just does not add up at all. Even if you were to use One Piece Film Red, a movie that isn't even canon to the manga, and use it to highlight and mention, you know, abilities that Shanks has displayed that allegedly supersede his swordsmanship, or use Volume 4 Billion, the magazine that was attached to the movie, where Oda has handwritten notes about Shanks' abilities. Even if you were to use all this to try and make the case that Shanks has these abilities that supersede his swordsmanship, in the promotional material to One Piece Film Red, Oda's publication team, when describing and talking about Shanks, literally states that he's a swordmaster and hypes up his strength as once being on par with the world's strongest swordsman, Mihawk. So even if you were to use One Piece Film Red, it doesn't even help the case of Shanks being stronger than Mihawk. In fact, it literally states the opposite. So now let's tackle this idea between skill and strength or power. Now honestly, whenever people try to make this separation between skill or strength or overall power, whatever, in the context of One Piece, I'm genuinely perplexed on what they actually mean or how they define strength and overall power. Since when in the context of One Piece has there been a basis for a separation between skill and power? Because in fact, it's quite the contrary. One example being the Beast Pirate crew. Who's Who says that this organization is a meritocracy, which means that everything is ranked or based on merit, right? The ranks are determined by a difference in skill. This is what Who's Who is saying. Headliners are below Flying Six are below the lead performers because the higher ranks are more skillful than the lower ranks. Or in other words, they are stronger. Now, if I was to separate skill from overall strength or power, could I come to this rationale that the only reason why Jinbei currently has a higher bounty than Sanji is because Who's Who is actually stronger than Queen, however Queen is more skillful than Who's Who? Sounds really stupid when you say it out loud, because it is. Another example would be Zoro after fighting Kamazo, also known as Killer. He says that the reason why he was wounded in that fight due to Gukimaru's interference was because of the fact that he lacked skill, lacked strength. It's the same in context. Now, when it comes to the Mihawk vs Shanks debate specifically, those that argue a separation between swordsmanship and overall power, that Mihawk can still be the greatest swordsman, he has better swordsmanship than Shanks, but Shanks being overall more powerful, usually highlight the difference being Haki. However, in doing so, is essentially suggesting that swordsmanship or high-level swordsmanship isn't rooted in Haki, which is such an asinine position to take. For example, I'm sure that everyone can accept and will agree that the breath of all things is a sword skill. A skill that Zoro used in Alabasta to cut steel and defeat Mr. One. Now, I have made a separate video talking about the breath of all things in detail and how it is Haki. However, the point is that by Zoro learning this skill of the breath of all things, which is Haki, he became stronger. By Zoro becoming more skillful during the fight against Mr. One, he became stronger. Now, at the end of Alabasta, he starts training again because he can't use that power at will at that point in the story. However, Zoro says that if he can't use that power, he calls the breath of all things, which is a sword skill, power. If he can't use that strength at will, he hasn't become any stronger. See, there's just no distinction between sword skill, swordsmanship, and power. Well, despite that, others may say, well, that's just armament and observation Haki. Obviously, those can be a part of swordsmanship. You need armament Haki to make a black blade, yada yada yada. That's what Zoro learned with Mihawk over the time skip, yada yada yada. But the real difference between a sword wielder like Shanks, who isn't a swordsman, allegedly, and a sword wielder like Mihawk, who is a swordsman, is Conqueror's Haki. Yes, Conqueror's Haki can make the difference. Okay, for argument's sake, let's go with that. Does that mean that the way that Zoro defeated King wasn't through swordsmanship because he infused Conqueror's Haki through his swords? Is that what it means now? Is there now a separation between when Zoro doesn't use Conqueror's Haki and when he does use Conqueror's Haki? Because when he does use Conqueror's Haki, that is no longer swordsmanship. But when he doesn't use Conqueror's Haki, it's all fair game. It's kind of weird, because when Zoro ultimately fights Mihawk in the future, he's going to use everything that he's learnt up until that point, which includes infusing Conqueror's Haki in his sword or any other Conqueror's Haki ability that he may learn later on in the story. So does that mean that when Zoro defeats Mihawk, he actually hasn't become more skilled than Mihawk because he needed external powers to defeat him? It's just a really weird position to take, and I don't think that overcomplicating like this is a good hill to die on, with all due respect. So these arguments like Shanks can be stronger than Mihawk because he's a sword wielder like King, who isn't a swordsman, or at the very least Zoro didn't acknowledge him to be a swordsman, so he doesn't fit under Mihawk's title. Doesn't really work because there is no basis for this in the story. The other arguments being that Shanks is a swordsman, but he has other weapons or abilities outside of swordsmanship, which would make his overall power greater than Mihawk. Doesn't really work because you still can have other abilities and powers alongside your swordsmanship and still be categorized as only a swordsman, like Kaku, like Big Mom, like Law, like Hawkins. And lastly, the idea that swordsmanship or sword skill and overall power and Haki are mutually exclusive falls flat, as I have demonstrated. It also doesn't help the Shanks argument that Mihawk has no interest and doesn't care about being an emperor, which is an argument that those in favor of Shanks have tried to use in the past to say that there's a separation between Mihawk and Shanks and that there's a difference in the way they are portrayed in the story. Shanks is an emperor, Mihawk isn't, so Shanks is better than Mihawk because the emperors are the greatest pirates. Well, that argument is out of the window when Mihawk doesn't even value it at all. On top of the fact that Mihawk's bounty, which is valued predominantly based on his strength as the world's strongest swordsman, is only roughly 500 million less than Shanks's, which is the difference in the bounties between Whitebeard and Roger. And the difference between Mihawk and Shanks is that Shanks has territories, he has world influence, and he has a large crew, whereas Mihawk is just one man with one black blade, and he's just really strong. Ultimately speaking, with all the information we have readily available as of chapter 1058, there is nothing to suggest that Shanks isn't a swordsman that wouldn't fall under Mihawk's title as the world's strongest swordsman. Honestly, all that sword skill versus Haki power debates are genuinely made redundant in front of plain black and white logic that Shanks is a swordsman and Mihawk is the strongest swordsman alive. Even Oda labels Shanks as a swordsman alongside other prominent swordsmen in artwork that was put into the Usopp gallery. Until there is new information to suggest otherwise, there's just a large preponderance of evidence that Mihawk is stronger than Shanks, and that's just the simple truth. So yeah, that pretty much says it all for Mihawk versus Shanks. I do have a separate video covering this subject in more detail, as this video was mainly addressing and tackling talking points that would arise from chapter 1058 specifically. So if you want to know more details about this subject, I highly suggest checking out that video. With all that said, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed. That would be much appreciated. I've been the one and only Sage, and until next time.